Welcome to CTV's Capital Dispatch with Rachel Aiello.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Capital Dispatch. So there are 4 things that happened this week that I want to go through with you. First, of course, is the continued fallout over the federal government's climb down on the carbon tax. So what we saw last week was the Prime Minister announce a trio of measures. The main one that's kind of raised the most eyebrows is this promise to pause the price on pollution on home heating oil for 3 years. This specifically has raised eyebrows and caused tension across the country because predominantly who this will benefit are Atlantic Canadians. And there's a whole flurry around whether or not this was politically motivated. We'll get to that in a second. But why I found this story interesting this week was because of how intensely developmental and political it was. First, we saw Monday, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre dominate question period, question after question to the government over this. He has been pushing for them to expand this easing off of the carbon tax on home heating oil to all forms of home heating, natural gas, for example. So he's really been going hard at them on that. And then in the face of this, we saw Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson and then the Prime Minister come out on Tuesday and say quite unequivocally, no more carve-outs will be coming. So all of these calls for them to broaden this easing off of the carbon tax won't happen. Essentially, they're saying this was a very targeted measure meant to tackle home heating oil because it is more costly, more polluting, and more impacting lower income Canadians. They want them to transition off home heating oil the way they pushed for the transition off of coal. And so that is why they put this specific measure in place. And despite the pushback, they're not looking to extend this to more Canadians who arguably might have a bit less of a financial impact from the kind of home heating they're using this winter. And then that brought us to Wednesday. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre met with his caucus. All parties meet with our caucuses on Wednesdays. But he opened up the doors to the media off the top to hear his opening remarks. And this is always an indication to us that, oh, he's got something to say that he wants us to hear. And did he ever? So he came out and essentially challenged the Prime Minister to a carbon tax election. He is saying, it's clear the Prime Minister has his position. I have mine. Why don't we pause the home heating oil carbon tax until Canadians go to the polls and have their say? Now, it's still the Prime Minister's purview should he want to call an early election. Right now, it's scheduled for 2025, which is still 2 years before this lifting, or 1 year before the lifting of this easing off would happen for the home heating oil folks. And the Liberals seem to kind of embrace this, which I thought was interesting. They seemed confident that they fought the last couple elections on their climate plan and would be happy to do so again. But the way things are going, I'm not sure that either side will be in a place where this will be, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre definitely wants to axe the tax, and he will be campaigning on that. The Liberals seem open to running on this, but some of their strategists are suggesting this week maybe they should continue to chip away at this policy and focus on something else come the next vote. So something to continue to watch there. Next week as well, the opposition will be teaming up to vote for a motion, non-binding, calling on the government once again to extend this exemption to all forms of home heating. So we'll be watching this continually as it develops, as the pressure increases. The immigration targets were also out this week. So Immigration Minister Mark Miller said essentially that they are going to be leveling out the amount of immigrants Canada is welcoming in 2026. We're going to stick to their plan for 2024, 2025, but that in a couple of years is when we'll see things ease off. This is coming amid some concerns about services available to immigrants, housing prices. So all of that was an interesting development this week. Something else you probably didn't notice I wanted to flag, there is a filibuster going on at the Natural Resources Committee. The Liberals and the NDP came out this week balking about what they considered a Circus Act amount of shenanigans that the Conservatives are engaged in. They're essentially blocking 2 energy job bills from moving forward for study. And the Liberals are concerned that this means their agenda won't move. The NDP are concerned this means workers aren't being heard from. So we'll see if that holds up into next week, but definitely a good example of some of the heated political language we heard on the Hill this week. And lastly, on interesting language on the Hill, the Prime Minister faced a call to resign this week. Senator, former Liberal, former Chrétien chief of staff turned independent senator, came out this week in a series of media appearances, essentially suggesting that the Prime Minister should really spend the next couple months considering whether or not he really does think he is best placed to lead the Liberal Party into the next election, suggesting perhaps they should bring the party back to the centre and find someone else to run against Poilievre. And the Prime Minister answered in, to me, an extremely interesting way. He was asked on his way into question period on Thursday, what do you think about what Senator Percy Down has said? He's like, who? Percy Down, the senator who wants you to quit. And he really just kind of grin on his face was like, oh, Percy, how's he doing? Yeah, I wish him the best, very much dismissing this. The Prime Minister remains adamant that he will be leading the Liberal Party into the next election, despite the current poll numbers, despite some of this chatter we're hearing about potential Liberal leadership hopefuls jockeying to replace him. So an interesting week, a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over the last 5 days.
Atlantic Caucus was vocal with what they've heard from their constituents, and perhaps they need to elect more Liberals on the prairies so that we can have that conversation as well.
So that was Rural Economic Development Minister Gudie Hutchings on CTV's Question Period on Sunday. This is my quote of the week because her comments here really set off, I think, way more of a firestorm around the government's carbon tax come down than maybe they would have faced otherwise. So she's essentially insinuating here that the decision was politically motivated. And a lot of people have said this week. She basically said the quiet part out loud, yes, we know politicians campaign and make policy decisions mindful of what their voters would support. But I think to suggest, and as Liberals have tried to pedal away from this week, that this policy was based on politics and the pressure that the Liberals were getting in Atlantic Canada was kind of crass and really upset a lot of folks, suggesting that, the Prime Minister governs for all Canadians and his policy should apply equally. The Liberals have noted this policy does apply across the country, just disproportionately Atlantic Canadians are benefiting from it. I just think it was a really interesting moment of, it doesn't happen very often where a minister gets clipped like this and it becomes a national news story. We had premiers reacting. Obviously, we had opposition in the House all week really decrying this. For the record, we have not heard from Minister Hutchings since, but we have heard from some of her Liberal colleagues who were faced with questions from reporters about whether or not they agreed with her seeming sentiment that you need to elect more Liberals to get the policies you want. One of her colleagues from Atlantic Canada, Cody Blois, called it unfortunate. Okay, so there's 3 things happening next week that I think you should be watching for. One is going to be what comes of the Friday meeting between Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland and her provincial counterparts on Alberta's potential pullout of the Canada Pension Plan. So Alberta is pushing forward with this idea that they would like to remove their province from this social safety net, start up one of their own Alberta pension plans. And this has been met with serious concern from across the country. So Freeland has convened finance ministers on Friday. They're meeting to talk about, what are next steps, airing probably some of their concerns about what this would mean for the stability of the country and the security of all Canadians' pensions should Alberta pursue this. So we'll be watching to see what comes from that meeting, what happens next. It's really been an emotional issue for a lot of Canadians. We're noticing a lot of interest in this online, so we'll be following the latest. Also next week, we are going to be getting an update on the foreign interference public inquiry. This week, the justice leading it came out with kind of an initial status update, letting us know the work she's been doing since September when she took the job on. And this has included a plan that's going to see a 2-phased approach to these foreign interference hearings. One focused on what happened in 2019 and 2021 in those elections, how the government responded, and then looking to what further tools or capabilities the government might need to combat foreign interference in the future. She's promising more information next Friday about what this will all look like, who might be able to apply for standing, and when exactly in the new year we would see those public hearings begin. And lastly, I wanted to highlight that on Friday or late Thursday evening, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly signaled that Canadians in the coming days would be able to leave Gaza. So over the last few days, we have been watching initial batches of foreign nationals being able to leave through the Rafah Rafah border crossing with Egypt, get out of Gaza, which remains a continuously dire humanitarian situation as the war between Israel and Hamas goes on. The question has been over the last couple of days, when are Canadians getting out? What are you doing? Obviously, as we've been talking about, there's been a series of plans in place. They're trying to communicate with the around 450 Canadians that have reported to the government as being in Gaza. And so we'll be watching to see if those Canadians are able to leave in the coming days. And then also what happens with Lebanon, where the Canadian government continues to warn Canadians, if you're there, it's now time to leave. So lots ahead next week. Thanks again so much for watching. Have a great weekend.